Okay, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is where Silent Heroes gets really exciting, where we dive into the research end. So, we're going to take a moment and welcome you to the first of our four content webinars. This series is a little different because we're not just looking at one conflict, we're actually looking at four different wars. And that's going to be the first piece of the program. And in the second part, we're going to talk about some of the practical tips for how do we research people's lives before the war. And we want to just make a point to say a huge thank you to the American Battle Monuments Commission for making this happen, for trusting us, and for sticking with us. And Liz, we're very happy to see you here tonight. We'll go ahead and make sure she's going to be with us tonight. So if you have questions about things that are going on or things that you're learning about the ABMC, she'll be a great resource in Q&A. Okay, let's go ahead and start with a few housekeeping items, some things that we just need to know. Um, this is right now Google Classroom sending you an email that says you didn't turn in your webinar. It's late. Oh no, you have a zero. You don't. It's cool. We'll get you checked off in the morning. The two systems don't interface, so it doesn't know that you're here. You have access to the Q&A box. Please use that throughout the night. We're going to specifically ask you to use it in the second part, but you can use it anytime. We don't have chat enabled because I work with students and I'm not dealing with that. We use live captioning here. It's good, but it is AI generated, so it's not perfect. Sometimes it says funny words. Sometimes the spelling's a little off. Roll with it. If it helps you, great. If it distracts you, just hit that CC button on your control panel. It'll turn it off. Just like before, we'll post the slides and the video link to Google Classroom so that you'll have access to everything that you see, especially if you want to borrow some of these visuals to use in your classes. Excuse me, where are we going? We are working between now and Halloween, October 31st, on life before the war. Our goal really for the 4 weeks of this unit is to research and learn as much as we can about our people and then organize that research. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. But think as you're working through the webinar, how can you break this down between now, October 7th, and the deadline, October 31st? Because we all know when there's 4 weeks worth of work and you try to do it in the 24 hours beforehand, well, let's be honest, we've been there, we have the t-shirts, and it's not a fun shirt to wear. So, without further ado, let me pass things over to Christopher Hamner to get started and talk the history piece, and then we'll jump in to do some research methods. So, Christopher, you're up. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Lynn. A huge thanks to ABMC for sponsoring this program, which I am super excited about. And a huge thanks to you all out in the audience for taking time out of a busy week to learn a little bit more about some of the context. This is kind of a challenging webinar because we're covering, as Lynn said, the four major conflicts that America engaged in the 20th century. And so my job is to give a little sort of national context about what is happening before each of these conflicts, from the First World War to the Second World War to Korea and to Vietnam. And I'm going to just point out a couple of very broad trends that I think might be useful to keep in mind as you're doing your research. So some idea of what is going on nationally as the United States goes into these wars. Lynn is going to take the second half and is going to talk about what's happening at the individual level and at the family level and at the community level, which is, I think, much more immediately useful to the research that you're conducting. Tonight, I just want to kind of point out some things that have to do with broad American attitudes about war and American society in the 20th century, and some things that might help kind of provide background as you're thinking about what your particular silent hero might have been confronting as he went off to war. So, um, these are four really different conflicts, obviously. But one thing that seems to unite them in a lot of interesting ways uh, is that the United States gets drawn in uh, to the Great War, to the Second World War, to the Korean conflict, and to the Vietnam War. These are wars that the United States is dragged into often after they've been raging for some time, and in some ways, the United States initially seems reluctant to go to war. So the decision to go to war in, say, 1917 comes after 3 years of fighting in Europe. The fighting breaks out in 1914. I love using some of these primary sources, newspaper front pages with my students because there's a lot going on and you can get right into the eyes of the people who are living through this moment. Kind of what would you be reading about with your breakfast and your morning paper if you'd been alive in the summer of 1914? Um, War will engulf Europe from, for the next several years and will produce a bloodshed that is without precedent in human history. And the United States, while the war is raging in Europe, is engulfed in a larger kind of political conversation about whether or not the fighting in Europe is related to American national interests, whether it is a war that the United States should get involved in or needs to get involved in. And one set of sources that I keep coming back to are pictures of protesters or people who are advocating for neutrality or non-intervention. And you can see there's kind of interesting language here in the sign that the people who are urging the United States to remain neutral are couching that in terms of patriotism. You'll see other political cartoons that and headlines that deal with major events that pro-interventionists are trying to point out indicate that this is a war the United States cannot ignore. But it's, I think, really useful as you're thinking about your soldier, if your soldier happens to be a Great War soldier, to appreciate that a lot of Americans are deeply, deeply, deeply ambivalent about the fighting in Europe before the United States joins in 1917. This is some sheet music for a sort of ballad about a mother talking about her profound reluctance to let her boy go off to war. And a thing that I notice in this set of sources and the next one I'm going to show you is that a lot of the pro-neutrality, anti-intervention advocates are mothers, women who use their status as the mothers of the men who will go off to fight as a way to strengthen their case. At the same time, ultimately the pro-intervention side is going to win the argument. Um, and as we'll see again in another set of sources, talking a lot about civilization calls and the need for Americans to wake up to the reality that confronts them. But if you're looking at either of the two world wars, a thing to keep in mind is that Americans are dragged reluctantly off to the fighting. By the time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, war had been raging in Europe for 2 years and some months. And there had been plenty of opportunities for Americans to get involved. And in fact, there is a push within the Roosevelt administration for Americans to aid the side that's fighting Hitler. And here you see political activists who are pushing against that. And again, it's mothers. You can see a couple of the signs talking about, I didn't raise my boy to die for Britain. There's an interesting one in the back there that I think is really kind of an interesting historical reference that helping the British, Benedict Arnold tried it, treason then and now. I mean, this is really powerful stuff that people who are urging Americans to stay out of the war are pushing the idea that it is a European war that doesn't involve American interests. And I think it's important to remember if you're studying somebody who went off to war in World War II, that the pro-neutrality side is the side of the argument that's winning. So if your silent hero is, in 1940, 1941 is reading newspapers and hearing political debate about whether or not this is an American war, a war that is about American interests, and the side that says Americans should remain neutral is the side that's carrying the day. You can see here some protesters. They are demonstrating against the Lend-Lease Act, which was a a sort of intermediate step by which the United States would furnish some supplies and materiel to the British. You'll notice that the Lend-Lease Act was officially House Resolution 1776, which is not a coincidence. It's given a very specific designation because that's a number that has a lot of political resonance in America. But also, it's mothers out there talking about the urgent need for Americans to remain neutral. In the upper right-hand corner, you see a little postcard that was distributed in my hometown of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, that was pre-filled out so that you could sign it and drop it in the mail to your congressman to urge them to vote against eliminating the neutrality acts, like the laws that are on the books to keep America out of the war. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is the side of the political discussion that is winning the debate up until December 6, 1941. And you can get a sense of some of the arguments they're using there. There are political actors and influencers who are trying to wake America up from what they see as a sort of dangerous slumber. If the drawing and art in this cartoon looks a little familiar to you, that's because this is Dr. Seuss, famous children's author and very prolific World War II cartoonist. And here I think he's really kind of tweaking the nose of the people who are pushing the idea that it is not an American war. There's Uncle Sam sleeping blissfully in his bed, while right next to him, there's Europe, which is suffering from a bevy of ailments that sound pretty miserable, Blitzpox and Nazi fever. And I think the joke here is that just because the beds are separate doesn't mean that the disease isn't transmissible, right? You have to wake up and do something rather than slumber happily. But this idea that the war is an ocean away, that it doesn't involve American interests, is the one that's winning. And in this cartoon, which is very much a pro-neutrality cartoon, you see democracy kind of on her knees, begging Uncle Sam to stay out, let war-mad Europe just burn itself to ashes. And then, hopefully in a decade or two, Uncle Sam, the United States, can go relight the torch of America, but that there's nothing to be done to save Europe from itself. My students always find it interesting to look at photographs of, pro-Nazi, pro-German rallies, the most famous of which is right in New York City in Madison Square Garden, um, and seeing, George Washington hung on banners alongside Nazi swastikas, like, is shocking. But again, like this is the conversation that's happening in 1939 and 1940 for most of 1941. And the neutrality side is the side that is winning right until December 7th, 1941. It is that attack on the American base of Pearl Harbor that shakes America out of its sleep. It's that attack that finally allows Roosevelt to successfully go to Congress and get a declaration of war. The other two conflicts come to a sort of slower boil, but again, there is a long political debate about each of them because in the case of Korea and Vietnam, it's not clear to a lot of Americans who might not even be able to find these places on a map what vital American interests are at stake that would warrant sending American sons and husbands and fathers and brothers off to fight and to maybe die. In the Korean Peninsula, the the American interests that are identified by the Truman administration have to do with uh, spreading democracy and preventing the expansion of communism. And that's a policy called containment that President Truman had laid out in several documents in the late 1940s. But here in 1947, you can see him addressing Congress talking about the, the policy of the United States to support people who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. That's communist. We must assist free peoples to work out their destinies in their own way. It's that leads America ultimately to get involved in the Korean Peninsula. This idea that America has a an urgent national interest in helping democracies fight against the expansion of communism. And in Southeast Asia, that's going to happen again a decade and a half later. And the justification will again be containment. Communism looks like it's trying to expand. The vital national interest there is making sure that it doesn't get a larger footprint. These are wars that America gets drawn into slowly, and they are wars that the average American, the family of your silent hero, their next door neighbors, might not have seen immediately how these conflicts are urgently linked to national interests. So that's one kind of big broad stroke. And the other big broad stroke that I think kind of connects all of the conflicts of the 20th century is the way in which the United States gets manpower to fight them. So you see here kind of an interesting graph of the American service personnel who were deployed to Vietnam from 1962 to 1972. There's a kind of interesting story going on in every conflict that America enters into about where are we going to get the people who are going to serve in frontline combat units, who are going to serve in support units. And in every case in the 20th century, that has involved some massive change in the social fabric. Here we've got a recruiting poster encouraging people to register for the war draft. And if we go back to 1914, the United States has fewer than 100,000 soldiers. And that is because, as we'll see in the 20th century, the United States has, for cultural and political reasons, kept its standing army as small as possible for the majority of its existence, and it has only expanded to meet emergencies. That's a common theme in American history. It goes all the way back to the Constitutional Convention. From 1914, less than 100,000 soldiers. It's tripled by 1917 on the eve of American entrance. It's gone up by a factor of 7 by 1918 to 2 million soldiers, a force large enough to actually deliver to the continent and participate in the fighting. But then, interestingly, 2 years later, we're right back down to 300,000. And that's the model for American military forces up until the end of World War II, to grow very rapidly in times of emergency and then to shrink back down. So if you're silent heroes from the world wars, that's a thing to kind of keep in the back of your mind. We'll see something really similar in the Second World War, 1939, 1940, the peacetime American military across all branches, 330,000, 450,000, tiny, tiny little forces. The United States is going to have to go to a draft to generate fighting forces large enough to participate in these huge conflicts. You can see here the registration card and newspaper headlines talking about the success of these government drives to get people into the armed forces. By 1945, we've taken a pre-war peacetime army of 330,000 and increased it to 12 million, which is just an astonishing growth. It works well enough to fight and contribute to the victory of World War II, but that's a massive amount of growth in a very short amount of time. Um, I got into military history because I was interested in stories, and so I always pause here with my students to talk about why soldiers are signing up for these various conflicts. And I like to grab some of the recruiting posters and primary sources that people would have seen in the moment. And I think there's a kind of interesting contrast here on the left, kind of ideological reasons for joining up, becoming a GI in the Second World War, that America has a tradition of fighting for liberty, that there's a kind of unbroken line going from the World War II GIs back to the Continental Army at Valley Forge. And it's a sort of patriotic and ideological case for fighting. And then on the right, something that seems pretty far removed from patriotism and ideology, and is just trying to position service in submarines, which is among the most dangerous service involved in the World War in any World War II branch, as not patriotic or ideological, but just something that your average 22-year-old American man might find really appealing. And I have a good time working through with my students kind of the sight lines here. Who's she looking at? Who's he looking at? Who's looking at us? What is the kind of story that's playing out there? One of the things that is, I think, really helpful to keep in mind is, the various uh, reasons that are being given to young Americans and to your silent heroes about the reasons why they need to join the military, why they need to submit themselves to conscription, what that process of going from civilian life to military life is going to be like. And keep in mind that for most of the people we're looking at, it's pretty abrupt. And it occurs against the context of this kind of long simmering conversation in the context of each conflict about whether or not America really needs to be in this fight. So there are interesting things going on in the households. The other thing I find really fascinating about the way in which the United States generates the manpower for these conflicts is the way in which conscription and the state's kind of claim on citizens and citizen support falls differently in some noticeable ways from, say, the 1940s into the 1970s. If history is a study of change over time, we see some really interesting changes in the ways that Americans across society mobilize for this war, for these wars. And this actually came up in my class just last week. So I have a lot of ROTC students taking my class, and somebody made a comment about uh, wealthy or privileged Americans in the 1940s being able to dodge military service. They just said that kind of casually as if that must be obviously true. Like, well, of course, those people, uh, we were looking at, some kind of upper class folks dressed to go out to dinner. Like those people don't wind up in the army, and so they aren't going to worry about fighting. And that gave me a chance to point out how different things felt in the 1940s. Um, one kind of interesting fact that I've uh, tossed out to a lot of my students, the college that has the largest number of graduates killed in World War II is West Point, which makes a lot of sense, right? Um, and then I open up the question, what is the college that has the second most graduates killed in World War II? And I get a lot of different guesses. The first one's usually the Naval Academy. Then people will say maybe the Citadel or VMI if they know those schools, or they'll say maybe the University of Texas or Ohio State or Texas A&M, someplace that's huge and has an ROTC program. And the answer is kind of surprising. It's Harvard, probably the most elite of the Ivy League schools, loses more of its graduates than any school but West Point. This is Harvard's Memorial Chapel. It's named for the graduates who were killed there, who were killed in American service, particularly in the world wars. And you can see I took these pictures when I was there decades ago. Like it is just a massively long list. Those walls are like 20 feet high. And I find that really interesting, especially because that's 1945. By the time we get to the Vietnam conflict, which goes on for a decade, this is the total roll of Harvard graduates who are killed in the war in Vietnam. Much smaller. Something has pretty dramatically has changed in the ways that America thinks about going to war and who ought to go to war and whose responsibility, who owes the state service. And there's, I think, a very palpable sense in the mid 20th century that people who had done really well in America, whose families could send them to Harvard, owed more. And that had kind of given way a quarter century later to a sense that, like, if you could avoid fighting in this conflict, if you had parents who could pull strings, then you should use them. And that to me is like a huge, uh, subtle but profound change in the way Americans are just thinking about who should go off. The Vietnam conflict is famous for depending on conscript armies, for getting, for drafting a lot of men to go fight in a war that became less and less popular over time as it seemed less and less likely to end in something like a policy victory. This is a great primary source from the second draft lottery, which was held in 1970. And you can see how they did it. So they would assign randomly numbers to each birthday. So 365 numbers. And then they would they would call numbers starting at one and go up as high as they need to until they had made that year's quota. And so if you hear people say they got a really good number, it meant that their birthday was, the 312th day of the that was on the calendar, and they were very unlikely to get that far into the calendar. So it's kind of interesting to find your birthday here and see if you were a young American man in 1970, where you would have been drafted, like what number. So I was born on July 25th, and there's me, number 003, which means if I had been born that year, I am in absolutely going. In fact, in 1970, they called the first 125 days. So about a third of the calendar is being called by the government to go off to service in a war that many of them by 1970 don't support. Either don't support the war or don't support, uh, especially their service in it. And so we're starting to see marches against the draft, marches against the war. There's some really interesting things going on um, in the way in which the anti-war movement is breaking along class lines. So you think of that short list of Harvard graduates who went off to Vietnam versus a large marching group of demonstrators here who are talking about the ways in which this has become a working class fight. And I find that to be pretty interesting too. These are things, uh, if your silent hero is Vietnam era, these are things that are going on in the background as they're going off to serve. These are things their families might be talking about. There is not in Vietnam the sort of whole of American society pulling with anything resembling unity in favor of the war effort. And then one other thing that I just find interesting because I love stories and I love change over time is to look at some of the messages that are going out between, say, 1942 and 1968 about military service and masculinity. On the left, its masculinity is being held up as synonymous with military service. Serving in the military makes you, more attractive to potential romantic partners. She's really focused on his submarine pin. On the right, you can see a draft resistance flyer that is completely inverting that and suggesting that resisting the draft, refusing to go to Vietnam is going to make you more attractive to potential romantic partners. And that's a lot of change over time crammed into a generation. So, whichever conflict you're studying, there is some sort of national level stuff going on in the background that is useful to keep in mind as you're going through the documents relating to your service member? Kind of what are the things that they might have been thinking before they got pulled into this conflict? What are the things their family members might have been talking about, their friends at school, their friends at work? Like, what is their kind of awareness of the national values? That's very big picture stuff. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Lynn, who's going to talk more about kind of the nuts and bolts of rolling up your sleeves and getting into research focused on your person that I think is going to fill in a lot more um, kind of important details. So let me hand the screen share to her.
All right. Thanks so much, Christopher. And I
Thank
think
you.
one of the things that we're always trying to do is to create this balance. How do we look at the big picture and then individualize the story? And the truth is, we can't do all of one or all of the other, right? We've got to have a sense of the world in which these people lived in order to really kind of give their stories the time and attention that they deserve. So, what we're going to talk about tonight is okay, how do we start this? And I know that sometimes this sounds like simple at first, but you find it's a little more complex than what it seems. So, what we're going to do is talk about some specific tips. How do we go about researching somebody's life before the war? And I like to start these off with a purpose and a particular person. We're going to use different people from the different wars, but we're going to start tonight with the story of Bruce Dean Bradley. So almost 84 years ago, he is on the USS Arizona. He is killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. You can see his name, it's a little fuzzy, on the Honolulu Memorial on the left and on the USS Arizona Memorial on the right. He dies in the bombing and the horrific fire like so many other sailors and Marines that day. But I think if we're going to do Bruce Dean Bradley justice, we can't spend all our time and attention focused on the day that he died. It's important, it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And if we really want to talk about these people as people, we need to focus on not just their experience in the service. You can see his picture in his Navy uniform. But I love this picture on the right. He is in the first row, the second from the right. This is his ninth grade picture. He looks awful young. He's one of those little ninth graders. He's probably the second or third shortest in his whole class. And so we have to tell the story of Bruce Dean at the different phases of his life. And we're not going to focus on the end because when we start with Silent Heroes, honestly, we pick them and find them at the end of their story. We can often figure out how they died relatively quickly. But now we need to go back and tell the story because, in the end, keep in mind our goal is to publish their story on nhdsilentheroes.org and then take that work for the ABMC. It'll get published on their website. And even more importantly, it will go to their interpretive guides at the cemeteries and the memorials to help them tell the stories. Now, spend some time, go to the gallery, sort by different metrics, read some of these stories. It's going to help you. It's going to give you some sense of how this works out. And I think no matter who we start with and where we go, one of the first sources we usually end up with is the US Census. The US Census was established in the US Constitution, so way back in 1787. And the purpose was to allot representation, right? How many slots did you get in the House of Representatives? And even though it started off for that purpose, it has really evolved into this remarkable historical record of very ordinary lives. And it's something that I was exposed to for the first time in college in a historical geography class. And it's probably one of my favorite types of primary sources to work with of all time. I like it because it creates snapshots of families and communities of the past that otherwise aren't recorded in the same way. Now, the way the census works is they divide the country, excuse me, into enumeration districts. And you can find these maps at the National Archives. If you live in a very rural area, for example, this is a map from Loup County, Nebraska, the districts are very large, right? It's going to take a long time for that census taker to get from home to home to home. The map on the right shows the northern part of New York City. That block in the middle is Central Park. And you can see every time you see a number with a circle, that's a different enumeration zone. So it can go from miles and miles to literally just a few blocks. And the goal of the census takers was to go door by door and record very particular information. So, what we're going to do in each of our live programs, we're going to use different examples from the four different wars. We're not going to try to cover examples from all four in the same time. That's just not going to work. But we're going to start back in World War I tonight and take a look at the Billheimer family, who are living in Rockingham County, Virginia in 1900. Now, I know this is a little hard to see. If you're like me, you need the glasses and you need to zoom in. And let's take away the cursor for a second and take a look at who's living in the Billheimer house in 1900. So just some basic information. The parents, the head of the household is Reuben Billheimer. He's 50 years old. He's a day laborer. He's married for 30 years to his wife, Anna. And I should have mentioned this is an African American family in Rockingham County. They have Anna's had 7 children, but only 4 of them are living. 2 of their sons are living with them, 28-year-old Saul, who's also a day laborer, and 24-year-old Roz, who is a teacher. In addition to that, the Billingheimer's daughter, Liza, is living with the family. She is marked as a widow, so presumably her husband was another one of the Billheimer sons. Her occupation is a servant, and her son, John, age 6, is living with the family. In addition, there are two other granddaughters, 2-year-old Polly and 8-month-old Anna, also living with the family, and another child named Edward Hall, who is age 6 and who is listed as a servant. Okay, all I've done here is transcribe the cursive. I'm going to ask you to go to the Q&A box. What are interesting observations or questions that this particular very simple 7 or 8 line primary source generates for you? What might be questions you would have, or what might be questions your students would have?
Oh, we just got a bunch. Where is the fourth child?
Mhm.
How did the children die? Why are the granddaughters not connected to an adult?
Yeah, and
What
here's the
it
key. They are connected to an adult, right? But we don't necessarily know based on the census who their parents are. We know about Liza and John through some other sources, and I threw that in because John is our silent hero here. But you're right, we don't know. So that's a good question. We have to figure out, are these Saul's children, Roz's children, someone else's children? Are they also Liz's husband? We don't know that yet.
what is a child servant?
Yeah, that one got me. Like I have to tell you, like I looked really long and hard at that one. Edward is somebody we need to know a lot more of because he could have been a servant in the traditional sense, but we also know that sometimes this is 1900. So a non-family relation, like what we might call a foster child or a guardianship or something like that, there's not really a word in the census for that, right? So, because they're not technically, legally, maybe a child. So that's an interesting question that we've got to dive in more. Who is Edward?
And a couple connected to that, what is his connection to the family?
Mm-hmm.
And what constitutes a servant,
Mm-hmm.
which is going on what you're talking about. How did Roz become a teacher?
Mm-hmm.
Who are Polly and Anna's parents?
Mm-hmm.
Um, where did Edward come from?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, who did the grandchildren belong to? Who is Liza a servant for?
Mm-hmm.
That's a new one. Um, what is the procedure to obtain these records? What additional information can be found based on the census?
Mm-hmm. Well,
Um,
let's address that one for a second here, because
okay.
what we see here is what's called the manuscript census, the line by line manuscript that's literally handwritten in at this time. These exist and are available on the public record. They're available through Ancestry or Ancestry Classroom up through 1950. There are census records for 1960, 70, 80, 90, but those are not released in the manuscript form, only the aggregate form. So, like percentages of people and total numbers. And that's because of privacy law. You have to wait at least 72 years. So, the 1950 census was only released a couple of years ago. And we won't have 1960 till sometime in the 2030s. Because the idea is there's a lot of personal information here that you could use for, good or bad. Um, this, though, is something that it almost, when we read it quickly, we get quick information. But when we start to think and pause and ask questions, now we've got a lot of different research pathways and things to go down to learn about who these other people were. What do we know about the family? So I'm going to ask one more question. Based on this information in aggregate, what else might we think about the family? What might we presume to know based on what we see? This is an African American family living in Virginia. What questions might we ask? What inferences
Plus,
might we make?
someone asked they own their farm, but why are they day laborers?
Exactly. So the family owns some land, but where is this land? Is it farmable land? But it must be hard to make ends, and being a day laborer is hard, right? That's a very unstable economic situation. You work some days, you're not guaranteed work every day.
Someone asked, were the parents enslaved?
We don't know that. We know if Reuben is 50 years old in 1900, he could have been, but we don't know that from this record. That would be something we'd have to trace in another way, but he could have, he would have been born in 1850. So that is a possibility, but we don't know. Again, good
Uh,
question. We have to find more sources.
how big is their home? Are they sharing small spaces?
Yeah, we don't know how big is the land, how big is the farm, how many people. I mean, there's at least one, two, three, four, five adults and four children in the house. That's a lot. So, can we learn more about this property or maybe buildings on this property if they still exist, knowing that was 125 years ago? Chances are the building may not be here anymore.
Were they born here or did they migrate there?
Ah, interesting. In many of the census records, you have where they were born and where their parents are born. And if we look at the Bilheimer family, they were all born in Virginia and their parents were born in Virginia. So that's another really good clue. So we're going to be tracing more into Virginia records to find more. All right, how about one more observation or question?
Somebody asked, could the term day laborer possibly mean farmer on a census record?
That's a good question. We'd have to go back and do a little digging to see what the categories were. And what was the difference between being a farmer of your own land versus working on someone else's land? Great questions. So when you find these sources, take some time, dig in. Literally, I would suggest print them out and start scribbling ideas, questions, add post-it notes, add thoughts. To be honest, you're not going to be able to answer every question you want, and some of them are just going to stick in your research brain and drive you a little nuts. But that's okay because that's what gets us some really good answers. All right, I want to zoom ahead a little bit in the story. And I'm going to tell you from a little bit of future digging, we know that when John, our 6-year-old here, is about 22 years old, his grandmother, Anna, dies. And John leaves Virginia to move in with his uncle Solomon, who we think is Saul here, but I can't tell you that for 100% sure. And Saul is not living in Virginia at the time because Saul has moved to Chicago. So, where we find John Bilheimer in 1917, so 17 years later, in his 20s, is in Chicago. This is his World War I draft card. Go ahead into that Q&A box. What other, again, very simple document. What else do we learn about John just from this source?
Date of birth?
Mhm. We have an exact date now. We can tell you exactly when he was born. He's got that.
Appearance, that he was single,
Mhm.
his race, the town in Virginia he was born,
Mhm. So we don't just have the
his
county. Now we could narrow it down to a specific town. That's going to give us some hints, especially when we get to our home front section.
his employer.
Mhm. Yeah, what is
He's not bald? Question
the
mark,
bald thing is
exclamation
on World
point.
War I and World War II cards. It was a big deal, y'all. I don't quite know why, but that question, is he bald? Yes or no, was very important. What was his job? How was he? I mean, he was working, right? He's a young man working in Chicago. What is he doing?
Oh, someone mentioned citizenship status too.
Yes.
Um,
In World War
teaming.
One, about
Te
25% of the U.S. Army in World War One were not U.S. citizens.
we've got teaming
Fun
with a
fact.
question mark, and then what is teaming? And then teaming dot dot dot. Is that a teamster?
Ah, it's going to have something to do with transportation, something with driving and moving goods. Could that, it's 1917, could it be with horses? Maybe. Could it be in a truck of some kind? Maybe. But we also have a really interesting clue here. We know where he worked. We know he worked for J.W. Ketchum. So that's another research avenue. Is this an individual? Is this a tradesman? Is this a factory? Is this a company? I don't know, but we've got a name and an address. So that's another thing that we could search. Maybe that might help answer our question of what was he doing, or maybe what goods was he hauling around Chicago?
Someone wanted to know how you found him in Chicago. Can you just restate that?
Honestly, it's using Ancestry and using the key markers we know, his date of birth and his name, and matching everything up. Now, we always have to be careful because of repeat names. So that's why dates of birth are really important, and making sure when we can see connections and making sure everything else is lining up. If I know that John Bilheimer was in an African American family in 1900, and then I find a John Bilheimer who's white in Chicago, there's a good chance it's not the same John. Not impossible, but there's a very good chance of that. So it's about checking and corroborating and lining up the details. And honestly, if you start to get records and things aren't matching, that's a red flag. That's a hey, reach out to your research mentor, reach out to Kate, be like, hey, can you look at these for me? I'm having trouble. Because sometimes, honestly, there's just a mistake in a record. It happens all the time. But if things aren't lining up or something starts smelling fishy, bring us in, let us look at it with you and help you try to figure it out. Because honestly, everybody's a puzzle and everybody's a mystery. And that's why it's going to take us 4 months to write these. It's not something you can do in 2 hours.
I have one more for you. Someone picked up on line 11, wanting to know, was he previously in the military? It says private under question 11. What
Mhm.
military service have you had?
It says branch ING. Any guesses what ING could be? Hint, Chicago.
Hint, it's in the news right now.
What's our state?
Illinois National Guard.
Yes.
We got it.
But it says he's been in the Illinois National Guard for how long? 1 week. Oh, so he's just joined the Illinois National Guard and now he's filling out his draft card. Again, lots of interesting things on a document that on its face looks very, very simple. Okay, let me jump ahead. I want to round out our story on John. John does serve in World War I. He is assigned to the 93rd Infantry Division, the 370th Infantry Regiment. Their nickname were the Black Devils. He served in a segregated army where very few very few African American soldiers saw combat. Those who did, like John's unit, were attached often to the French army. His unit was attached to the French 10th Army, and he did see combat, but he doesn't necessarily die in the way that we think, right? We have these visions of trench warfare. That's very, very true for many of our soldiers. But John is serving on November 3rd, 1918. He is sent out on maneuvers during the day, and the soldiers come back to a building in the evening where they are making their dinner. They are sitting to eat dinner where the building they are in is accidentally shelled. And John, along with 34 other soldiers, is killed pretty instantly. He is remembered at Wazan American Cemetery in France, and it's one of the places that I've had the honor to visit. Now, before we jump into the last piece, I want us to keep in mind that while the census is a great starting point, it's not always correct. It's not always there, and we can't always find the people that we want to find. So just think about all the reasons that people might not have wanted to talk to a census taker. It can be anything from something practical, like, I don't know, they were at work and nobody was home. But it also could be people who were nervous to talk to the census taker, who maybe didn't speak the same language, who maybe didn't know what to say or were afraid of giving information to the federal government. So keep in mind that the information that's in the census is very important. We're going to find as much as we can. And I'm going to give you a pro tip. If you have trouble finding your person, try to find the people around them. Make sure to look up mom, make sure to look up dad, make sure to look up the names of brothers and sisters, because sometimes it won't always hit with that person, but if you search for somebody else, it can open a whole other avenue of the story. All right, so where do we go with this? Let's look at this from a very practical point of view. Quick recap here. We start with the census. What facts can we determine? Name, ages, location. What can we learn not just about the individual, but their family? Don't just look at one family on the line. Look up and down the page. Click the right and left arrows to go to the page before and after, because census takers, as much as possible, literally went down the street, whether that's a long country road or literally tenement to tenement in a place like New York City. Who are the families around this? What do we know about the community, the economics, the neighborhood? What inferences can we make about the family and their living conditions? And what questions can we generate? Again, we're not going to be able to answer them, all of them, but you'd be surprised how many we can find some answers to. Now, what are we looking at in this module? Our goal is to learn as much about the person from the time they were born to the point that they enter the military. And sometimes I know when you do this, you find stuff from later and it's really exciting. And I'm going to encourage you to put it in the folder and put it aside for now. We just want to focus on the first part. We want to talk about families, communities, education, work, trade, religion, hobbies. Who were these people before they were soldiers or sailors or Marines? Looking at the sources really gets to tell some unique stories. For some of you, you're going to be doing research into things like college or high school yearbooks. Some of you might find that your silent heroes were athletes and they were written up in the local papers for their plays on the football field or the basketball court. Sometimes you might be able to find the house that your silent hero lived in. Some of them are still standing. Sometimes you uncover stories you never expected. Like, for example, one of our silent heroes, both him and his father were beach boys on Waikiki Beach. If you think of a beach boy, it's kind of like a cross between a lifeguard and a surf instructor. So these background stories give us a sense of the person and the family. No matter what source you find, go through these steps in your head. What is it? Analyze it, break it apart. What can we learn? Save the source with a clear file name and put it in your Google Drive. That's really important. So you're going to need those later. And trust me, you're going to be your best friend by saving everything now. Put what you learn in your research organizer. Add questions. We have a section for questions, things you don't know yet. You might be able to figure it out, you might not. And add your citation. So what we have done, and a big thank you to Kate for setting up everybody's folders, is that we have research organizers. Each one starts with a prompt, some questions to get you started. Don't take them too literally, like, right? When and where was your silent hero born? Okay, yeah, there is an answer, like a specific date and place, but what else do we know about where they lived or what they did? In your responses, resist the urge to cut and paste. Put this in your own words. Take that time to synthesize what it is you've found. As importantly, because we are publishing these, we have to verify and cross-check every fact. So it's important that you tell us how you know what you know. If it's on the internet, link to it. And if it's on Ancestry or Ancestry Classroom or any other database like newspapers.com, any local newspaper databases that you have access to, it's super important to please download a copy of your source and put them into your Google Drive with logical file names. So it should be easy to find Smith family 1940 census, Smith family 1930 census. It'll help them go through. It helps them cross-check, but also it might help your research mentor give you a tip or a hint or say, hey, did you notice that? Did you see that? I was intrigued by that. We have a section for additional information. Maybe you find something that wasn't in one of the prompts. But again, if you find stuff about later in life, that's great. Hold on to it. We also have a spot for questions. One thing that we also have a space for is bibliography. It's so important that we track our sources as we go. So we've created a chart with the most common types of sources. We use Chicago formatting, and some of the sources that you're looking at are relatively unique. So we have sample citations on the left that you can literally copy and paste and make your own citation by just changing out the specific details like the date you access the site, the name under the record, the URL that you found it. So use these strategies to help you keep track. Doing it as you go is going to save you and, quite frankly, the editing team so much time. All right, I'm going to wrap with a couple pro tips. If you're somebody who's maybe new to Google Classroom, you're not as familiar how to work with Google Drive or how to submit assignments, we have a help video that walks you through step by step. Trust me, take the time to watch it. It's going to save you time in the end. Put it on while you're cleaning up your classroom tomorrow. It's going to get you the gist. And if you forget how to do something, you can go back. Second tip, pace yourself. Research takes time. Do a little bit each week. Schedule time for yourself that you can work on this uninterrupted, because sometimes you got to work on something and then think about it and come back to it. So if we know that it's due on the 31st, work in the time for yourself. Stay focused on life before the war. Avoid that tendency to jump ahead. If you find something that's great, put it on the shelf. We'll come back to it. Ask good questions. Try to find the answers. Don't forget to search different names, not just your person's name. Look for mom, look for dad, look for brothers and sisters, spouses, or children if that is relevant. We have specific tips in the guide to try to find family, some things you might be able to do, especially if this is in your community, to see if this person has living relatives who you might be able to talk to. The last piece I'm going to say is research is inherently uneven. There are days where you're going to sit down for an hour and you're going to find 6 different amazing resources. And then the next day you could work for 2 hours and find nothing new. You're not going to get everything, but we want to maximize the things that we have. And if you get to the point where you have this, I'm finding nothing and I'm frustrated and I can't do this feeling, stop, acknowledge that. Know this is something your students deal with all the time and reach out. Send a note. Hey, can we get a meeting? If you send a note to your research mentor, to Kate and me, hey, this is when I can meet. I can meet from 12:30 to 1:30 Mountain Time on Tuesday or Friday after, 3 p.m. Let us know that. Between our team, I will get someone on that call to work with you. We'll make sure to meet your time and be able to help you. That being said, we can't help you the night that it's due, right? So we've got to work ahead so that we can put you on a really good path to success. All right, we've done a lot tonight, and this is really exciting. And we're 3 minutes under the hour, which means we are on time or early, which is always good. So just like we do at the end of every webinar, we're going to ask you to please do a survey. This gives us your attendance credit. It also gives us the feedback that we can use to tweak and adjust what we're going to do when we see you next month at the beginning of November. So you can either use your phone and scan the QR code, or you can use the website tinyurl.com/nhd-abmc-live. We keep it pretty simple here when I make tiny URLs because I need them obvious or I won't remember what they go to. So what we're going to do is step back here, ask you to do your survey, but also open up to question and answer. And you can ask about the history pieces. You can ask about the research. You can ask about what you've learned about the ABMC and the history of the American Battle Monuments Commission, some of that stuff from the last module that you were reading and watching, because we'd love to make sure that you leave here with your questions answered. That being said, we also know we're up against an hour. So if you need to head out because you've got to get somebody to bed or finish grading or eat your dinner, we understand all of those things and are going to thank you for your time tonight. So why don't we go ahead and transition ourselves? I'm going to leave this slide up if anybody needs it. But Kate, do we have any questions in the queue?
We do. Do we have a sample formal letter if we are reaching out to family members?
Actually, we do have a sample formal letter, and we will go ahead and post it. We do have one. We will go ahead and post it into the module tomorrow, a sample that you can use and tweak and kind of put your own information in.
I will put that on my to-do list.
Excellent.
Um, da, 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 da. Someone is still having Ancestry classroom issues, so we can reach out to them
Hmm.
separately. And
We'll reach
anyone
out.
else
Let
who's
us know
having
too.
issues,
Yeah.
let us know. We need to know that. Um, the I have begun looking for my man, James Lohman Fraser, on several websites. They have the wrong picture of him. I don't know who the man is, but he isn't the one in our yearbook who his daughter has identified. Does this happen?
Oh, yes, it does. Honestly, there's a lot of what I call armchair historians. And what people do is they find the first source, especially with a name like a James Fraser, that there's going to be a lot of people with that name. And they find something and then they kind of roll with it. If you find an error, let us know. We'll go ahead and at some of these places we have contacts and we'll go, try to reach out to them. But unfortunately, we don't have, we can't stop anybody from putting anything up on the internet. But it's why we're so fastidious about checking the facts, being sure if you say this is your silent hero's birthday, that's one of the things your research manager is going to go in and check off. Yep, that's correct. And it's to make sure it's the 12th and not the 21st. And if we have a dispute, sometimes like somebody's name is spelled differently or there's two potential dates, we're going to look at as many sources as we have and try to corroborate them. Or we try to say, hey, you know what? It's only wrong in this one. Everything else is consistent. Or you know what? When this guy joined the military, he wrote this in his own handwriting. So chances are this is more likely to be correct than something somebody else wrote down. But yeah, when you find these sticking points, let us know and we'll help you try to figure it out.
Okay, I just want to acknowledge, Michelle, I will reach out to you separately, just so you don't think I didn't see your comment there. And then someone said, no question, just wanted to say I reached out to my research supervisor the other night when I felt like I had a little block, and his response was so quick and so helpful. Highly recommend getting a thinking buddy. So yes, please.
It's
They're
always a
like,
good thing. That's I know sometimes there's this sense like if I reach out to this person, I'm bothering them or they're busy. This is their job. Like Kate and I run the logistics so that the research mentors focus on the research. And honestly, they love this stuff. They're really into it. Not only have they done this, some of them one or two times, they asked to come back. So these are people who really love this. So please, please do reach out to your mentors. And if you ever try to reach out and maybe they've missed an email, you haven't seen them, let us know. We'll help you.
I noticed that the spreadsheet says my person was born in a DP camp in Germany. What if there is no previous census info for this family before 1950?
Ah, so that's a displaced persons camp in Germany. So this is going to tie into some very interesting history. Well, first off, we're going to have to start with what we have. What I would say is, Allison, reach out to me because I'm this big of a nerd. I have an Ancestry International account. I will look and see if I can find any additional sources. I don't know if I will or not. We know that because of World War II, a lot of files and a lot of historical records, particularly in Germany and Eastern Europe, were destroyed, but we don't know until we look. So, send me what you have, shoot me a note. Let's see what we can find. But we might need to start the story there. Sometimes we just end up with these gaps where we're like, hey, we don't know what happened in this decade in between. We know he was living here, and then we know a decade later he's here. And we just have to be honest about what we know and don't know.
The teacher with the wrong picture being posted thinks it might be on the DPAA website.
Yeah. Well,
So,
we have
you know,
people there. We can have them take a look
can
at it.
reach out.
We can't force anyone to change their website. The only website we can control is ours. But in my experience, the people who do this kind of work, and the DPAA is probably the best of these people in ways I can't even describe to you, do their best to get it right. And this is where, we want to work, we'll work with them, especially if we have a family member involved, we can help sometimes make a connection and then get some things updated.
And I know when I did my Silent Hero, the birthday that they had on the web was wrong and they fixed it. So it does happen. That's it for questions.
All right. Well, we'll give it just a second and see if there's any others that pop in. But Christopher, do you have any last thoughts? Or Liz, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with the group?
I have one quick one. I always love being walked through by you, the kind of research process of the census records and kind of unpacking complicated family. It's spellbinding to me, and I find myself just squinting at the screen and to read the documents, which is the detective work that we all love. And I'm always kind of struck by the fact that the things that I talked about, these kind of big national events, are often kind of things that are happening in the background as people are focused on their daily lives of keeping the family intact, paying bills, relocating, sometimes over like big jumps. Like everybody is, I think, reasonably and understandably focused on trying to keep their little corner of the world together and thriving and happy if possible and intact. And then these huge, global events intrude on lives in ways that are not anticipated and often unwelcome, and then shake everything up. So I was, thinking about um, this guy who'd been in the Illinois National Guard for a whole week as he's filling out that document, and just like kind of what story would have been there.
Hmm. Well, and I think too, I think it's a good reminder. I think sometimes we think that complicated family structures are stories of what we deal with today, but people in the past didn't deal with that. And honestly, people are people. And I think by some ways, humanizing these people, realizing they have kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly in them, just like we do, helps make history more interesting. And while this is a
Yeah.
teacher program and a teacher class, I'm going to strongly encourage you to share what you're finding with your students. Whether you can share it in history class, whether you can make a bulletin board, maybe you have an advisory or a homeroom. I'll bet you if you come in and geek out over this stuff, there might be some students who want to geek out with you and might get really excited. I know that from doing some of this work by just dropping something is like, guys, guess what I found? Or I sent an email and I got this. Or look, I finally found a picture. Or check out this file. I can tell you, I got two files sent to me right before they were both postmarked on the 30th. They're over 200 pages each. There's going to be so much geeking out when these files come in to people. Mind you, all the requests have been sent in that you've provided us. However, NARA is on shutdown right now. So we're hoping that that's going to get resolved quickly and everything's going to get back. But we've done our part. And now we're just going to, I say the prayers to the archivist gods and hope that something good comes out. And we will, when we get to the military section, we're going to share everything we have with you. But I had to break the first two files into one into two parts and one into three parts to be able to scan it to myself and put it back together that way. So kind of cool.
I love this idea of like drawing in students, especially the ones who are maybe a little reluctant, like don't like history or think they don't like history yet, I guess is what I should say.
Hmm.
And we've talked in this program in previous iterations about historical empathy, which I think can be a really great way to bring people in, to humanize them and to think about how complicated and confusing and scary and uncertain the world that your person finds themselves in. And I'll never forget, like one of the big eye-opening experiences I had in the classroom was the pandemic spring in 2020. And I was teaching the World War II class, and we were about halfway through, and we went home for spring break, and we never came back. And so they had us, trying to conduct this classes online. But a couple of my students reached out and were like, I think I really understand what it would have been like to be at home during World War II a little bit more, because like I don't understand what's happening, and I'm getting all this different information, and I'm not sure, if I'm going to be able to buy toilet paper next week, or if people close to me are going to get sick, and I'm getting different people or different government organizations are telling me different things. And it's just very confusing and frightening and disorienting. And I imagine that's kind of what it was like to live through these events, which I thought was really great. I mean, we're reading, headlines today about wars that are going on uh, in other places that will be someone's primary sources in 40 or 50 years when they're teaching 2025. And this idea that kind of the way we're living things now is analogous to the way your family was experiencing the past in 1917 or 1943 or 1951 or 1968. It seems useful to me, especially for students who don't understand what all this is about.
Well, and I think too, sometimes stories, especially big stories in history, World War II, Vietnam, they're so massive they can become overwhelming. But hey, you know what? Let's teach the story through the eyes of one person. Let's talk about one person's experience in Vietnam in World War II. We're not saying everybody's experience was this, that's obviously not possible. But how can we personalize history? And what's a really important way to do this? Sometimes to just stopping and say, let's look at one person. Let's look at his military record. Let's look at his family. Let's look at his community. And let's look about what happened with him.
We have a couple teachers who are including the students. One shared the stories of the four men that they had narrowed it down to, and then let their kids vote on the silent hero that they're researching.
Love that.
So that's exciting. And then someone else said, my eighth graders are preparing to recognize a veteran from their family or friends. So this year I will recognize Seaman Payne and allow the kids to see the research process. Our school will place our veterans on our TV screens for 10 days, and it's their third year doing that with the eighth graders.
I think that's awesome. I want to encourage you to think about one thing. One thing that is different about the people we're studying in this class is that they never had the chance to become veterans. And I think recognizing veteran stories, those who served and came home, is different than recognizing those who never came home. So I love that you're using the research process with your students, but I might hold on sharing this story with the school until May. See if is this possible to build this into Memorial Day? Because I think sometimes we mix up these two stories. And I know sometimes when I started this, I thought that the cemeteries that the ABMC cares for in Europe, in Asia, that they were veteran cemeteries like Arlington or the ones in my community. But one thing that I learned very, very powerful and early on is these are military cemeteries, not veteran cemeteries, because the people buried and memorialized here never had the privilege to become a veteran. And I think helping to help our students see that distinction, as small as that is, and it's a very, very common thing. I think 85, 90% of Americans would see that way. But take this piece and say, hey, you know what? In November, we're going to memorialize our veterans. But then in May, we're going to tell some different stories of those who will forever have not returned from Europe, from Asia, from Vietnam, from Korea. So just something to think about and consider. But I love that you're using this process and sharing it with students. I think you're going to get some very excited students out of this.
We had some other people doing the same. And then we got a compliment, guys. This was super valuable, and thank you so much.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. I'm going to pause and stop our recording here. But before I do that, a huge thank you to our team at National History Day, to Christopher Hamner from George Mason, but to Liz DeLucia and the team at the American Battle Monuments Commission. We know you're all under a lot of stress right now, and we appreciate all that you are doing to keep this program alive and to help our teachers tell these amazing stories. And I can only hope that, we came up with some amazing stories last year, and I have some feelings that we might have some even better ones this year. So I'm going to say thank you on that point and pause our recording there.